Hey everybody, happy Monday. Only a few more sessions. I'm wondering if people want to share in the chat if they're registered for the exam. Don't feel like you have to. Full disclosure, I asked my boss years ago about taking the exam. He said he would absolutely support me. 2 years later, I took it and didn't tell him until after I got my results. So when I passed, I walked in his office and said, "Remember when you said you'd support me for taking the exam? By the way, I did." And so I totally understand people don't want to share. If you want to share that you're going to take it and you're excited, that's great as well. So hopefully people have gotten registered, and if you didn't and you're not ready to take it, you can always wait until spring. They've had the exam for quite a number of years, and hopefully they'll continue to have the exam. So with that, we are recording, so I'm going to start sharing my screen. And so what you're going to see here on the screen is actually a notice of award. And so yeah, usually I get my little bar saying that it's been shared. I don't see that, so can somebody chime in whether they can see the notice of award? Or okay, Jessica's nodding her head, so thank you, Jessica, for the head nod. Okay, so the first couple of slides are going through award elements. And so what I have here is a sample HRSA NOAA of award, which you can actually find on the internet if you just do a Google search. This one's been redacted, so that way you can't see who was the awarding agency and who the project director was. So, but just some things to point out. So first of all, just like the federal agencies are told what should go into a funding opportunity announcement, they're also told what really needs to show up on their award notices, whether it's in full text or by reference. So this is just one example, and this is a little bit older example. As you can see, it started in 2009, but we should know who the awarding agency is. And so these are for federal awards, okay? Hopefully non-federal is still giving us some of this information, but they don't have the same obligations that the federal awarding agencies have. So who is actually submitting, or who is making the award, and who is the award being made to? And that's something that's important for us to make sure that the award's actually for us. When I was at Miami University, we sometimes would get awards made out to University of Miami, but in Ohio, so we had actually just double check to make sure it was supposed to be our award and get them to put the right university name on it. So there should also be information on whether this is an assistance mechanism or not, and you would know that because it would have a CFDA number. So for all grants and cooperative agreements, or even fellowships. Fellowships is a type of assistant award. You would not have a CFDA number for a contract, but we should know if this is assistance, and if so, the CFDA number that's associated with the award number. The project period should be listed, and the federal agencies will list the budget period separate from the project period. One thing you'll notice here is that the project period starts in 2009 and goes to 2014, but the budget period's for only a year. So that will clue us in that we only have authorization for that one budget period that's listed there, and the next year we should get another authorization, and the next year clear until the project end date. So that way we know, if we're authorized for our entire project period, that budget, or if the budget's going to be incrementally funded. And it used to be the case years ago that National Science Foundation would incrementally fund, but a majority of their programs now, they send one award notice where the project period typically will match the budget period, or vice versa. The budget period will match the entire project period. But that information should be very transparent on the award notice. Also, some awarding agencies will actually have a budget breakdown listed in the award document, and they might break down the subawardees in their budget. They might at least break down the total cost versus indirect cost. Some may just attach the proposal that was approved, and that information is in that proposal. So again, the information has to be there, but how it has to be there, whether it's by reference or actually typed in here, is going to vary agency to agency. So just be familiar with the type of information that should be listed in an award notice. One thing I want to make sure people are aware of, I'm sure you all probably are, I don't know if it would come up on the exam or not, but just understanding a difference between a programmatic contact, that's typically the contact for the science and the program information. It's typically what we consider our pre-award contact, and if we have some changes that we might need to make, we might put those past the programmatic contact, versus the financial contact or contact in a grants management type role or office. Typically, if we have budgetary questions and award questions, we're going to go to somebody in the finance or in that grants management division of the sponsor. So programmatic is just what it says. It's the program technical aspect. Grants management is typically the financial and the award stuff. So if I was working with an investigator who at award stage had modifications, I would definitely make sure I'm getting in contact with the grants management office, but copying in and looping in that programmatic contact, so that way, particularly for a multi-year award, they're aware of what's going on. Okay, so let me now pull up the PowerPoint. There it is. Okay, so I just went through a few of the award elements that are going to be here in the PowerPoint. Again, I'm not going to read these to you, but the important thing to know here is that the uniform guidance does let the federal award agencies know what should go in that award document. And this is all of the information that's pulled right out of uniform guidance, right out of the text. Also, oops, I meant to go over this when I had that HRSA pulled up. In the HRSA award, they actually started with the specific program terms and conditions, and then they listed general HRSA terms and conditions, and then they listed kind of, general uniform guidance. So they had it kind of in an order of precedence there. So any kind of general terms and conditions may be by reference or may be listed out in your award notice. You want to pay particular attention to any program or award specific terms. And again, thinking about that order of precedence, those program and award specific terms are going to take precedence over any general terms and conditions. I personally like it when everything's written right there and I don't have to go hunt information down, but it seems like a lot of awarding agencies will have it by reference where you have to go to a website and find this information. I can understand why they do it. I just kind of like the one-stop shopping. So any questions on what needs to go into an award notice per uniform guidance? And I have the chat up, so if people have questions, feel free to unmute or throw something in the chat. Okay, so a little bit on award administration and management, again, from the perspective of the exam. Setting up the project is one of the most important steps in award management. Prior to setup, we need to make sure that the terms and conditions have been reviewed. Make sure that the investigator has all approved protocols in place. So if they were working with human subjects or animal subjects, last weekend we talked about all the regulatory compliance. And I gave you some different numbers that shows that the institution is in compliance, right? Like your animal welfare assurance number, your federal-wide assistance number. But here we're talking about, do your investigators actually have approved protocols from your IRB, Institutional Review Board, or from your IACUC, Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, to go ahead and start working on their project if those elements are involved. So we make sure all of that is in place before we're releasing funds to the investigators to get started. So just a quick word on project management. Basically, uniform guidance says that our financial management systems must be able to answer a number of questions, such as when does the project begin and end? So remember that in uniform guidance, the federal agencies are told that they have to show those project start and end dates in the award notice. Also, who has spending authority, and what spending authority do we have? You know, what part of the budget are we able to spend? You know, is it an increment or is it the entire budget? Our award management system should also show how much money has been obligated versus how much is remaining. When is the next increment of funding expected? Are there cost sharing requirements? And kind of like, and so on, right? So all of these things that are in the award notice, we should be able to track and have transparency into with our project management or our award management systems. Okay, and there are actual standards for financial and program management that are listed in uniform guidance, and I gave you the reference here. So everything here I've just taken right out of uniform guidance, and I'm going to talk just a little bit more in depth on financial controls and internal controls. So again, not to read slides to you, you have the information there, and I think I've already talked about this anyway. So okay, financial management systems must provide for, you know, control over and accountability of funds, comparison of your budget, you know, with the expenditures. Like I said, how much have you obligated, how much do you have left? And we're going to talk a little bit more about internal controls here in a minute, because with uniform guidance came more references, let's say, to internal controls than before. One thing uniform guidance does say is that, you know, making a distinction between direct and indirect cost. I'm not going to go back through this because when we talked about budgeting, we talked a lot about the differences between direct and indirect costs and total project cost. We've also talked about all of these, right? So these are your cost accountability, or sorry, your cost allowability, not accountability. So cost allowability. So as you hopefully recall, an allowable cost is one that can be charged to an award, either as a direct charge or could be counted as cost share. So before a cost can be defined as allowable, it has to meet the 4 cost principles. And when we talk about cost principles and we do talk about cost accounting standards, we typically, I think post-award. I think that we should be thinking about those things pre-award as we're putting together that budget to make sure that anything that's in that budget, you know, ultimately at the end can be expended and meet those cost allowability standards. So again, I didn't want to go spend a lot of time on this because I feel like we've already spent a lot of time when we talked about budgeting. Okay, internal controls. Subpart D of uniform guidance are your post-federal award requirements. Internal controls was mentioned like over 100 times in uniform guidance. And an internal control is simply a process for checks and balances, right? It's a process that we as a non-federal entity who've received federal funds have in place to assure the federal awarding agencies that we're consistent in our practices, that we're meeting our cost accounting standards, really that we're just, again, providing that checks and balances in our systems, so that we're not getting too far away from making an error until the time that we can correct that error, report that error, and make sure that error doesn't happen again. So internal controls is really there to make sure that we are efficient and that we're compliant with everything we do. I think, at least on the pre-award side of an internal, one thing I should say is in uniform guidance, they do not specify what our internal controls need to be. Instead, they say you have to have internal controls in place, but they don't say the internal controls have to look like A, B, or C. Now, there are some best practices that we share among universities, but they're not listed out. So you're not going to go in uniform guidance and see, oh, here's an example of an internal control for this process or this system. Instead, it's just going to say you have to have good internal controls in place. From the pre-award side of the house, I think about using our system. So we use quality research for developing our proposals. So if we actually use the budget module that is in quality research, that helps provide some internal controls in that it ensures that we're using the correct institutional base salary for our investigators. It ensures that we're using current fringe rates and current F&A rates, because all of that is incorporated into that budget module. So that's one way we have internal controls on the pre-award side. How about some of you who are post-awarders? Can you use the chat to talk about maybe some internal controls we have on the post-award side, or that you have if you're not at CSU? Can anybody think of any that we have? Separation of duties. Yes, exactly, Jessica. Some separation of duties, right? Somebody that inputs something into a system shouldn't be the one necessarily approving it, right? Because somebody else should be looking at that information, reviewing it to make sure it's accurate, and then maybe approving it. So separating those duties out. Perfect example of that. And I think sometimes that's difficult. I know Sylvia's on the call. I don't know if she struggles with this. I know it's something that we struggled with when I was at a predominantly undergraduate institution, because when you have one or two people doing everything, it's hard to do that separation of duty, right? Where does that go? There were a lot of times that I was my boss was a faculty member who submitted proposals. I had submission authority. I didn't feel comfortable signing, approving, and submitting my boss's proposals, because somebody could look at that and think, oh, well, there was undue influence there because he was my boss. So I always sent all of his proposals up to the president's office for review and approval. And they would kick him back and say, why are you doing this? You know, you're the one with authority to submit. I'm like, because he's my boss, right? I wanted that separation. I wanted somebody else that was above him in that chain of command to look at that information, make sure it was accurate, and make sure we were okay before we submitted it. Okay, Kara, types of documentation for expenses, that's a good one, right? Any kind of documentation that we have, and document. I was thinking about documentation, particularly when we do an error correction. Why is the error correction being done? Why did it have to be done? How does a new charge benefit where we're moving it to? And if it's really if it's been a long time before we caught this error and have corrected the error, what steps are we going to have in place to make sure we don't make that same error again? Okay, Becky, reconciliation processes to review expenditures. Yep, and effort certification processes. So yeah, exactly. So you all got it. And again, these are great examples, but they're not examples you're going to see in uniform guidance. Instead, uniform guidance has this vague information that I have on the slide, like take prompt action if you find something, take reasonable actions to make sure it doesn't happen again. It doesn't say exactly how we should do that. Okay. Okay. Award actions. Different types of award actions you should be aware of. And some of these, we may have to have sponsor prior approval to do them. Some of these we can do on our own, and we're going to go through some of those differences depending upon the award type, right? So making modifications to the budget, is that something we can just do on our own, or is that something we need prior approval? It depends. Change in scope of work almost always requires prior approval from the sponsor, particularly, you know, for federal sponsors, because the sponsor has awarded funds based on the proposal that was submitted. So if the investigator is now doing a different scope of work, the sponsor wants to know that, because maybe they didn't want to support that new scope of work. So regardless of whether the investigator has an associated budget change, if they're changing their scope of work, that almost always requires prior approval. Change in key personnel, typically if you change out, like the principal investigator or the co-principal investigator, somebody's moved, you'll have to have prior approval. Change in the level of effort really depends on how large that level of effort is, and again on the award type that we'll go through. Requesting no cost extensions. Oftentimes the first no cost extension with the federal agency doesn't require approval. We still have to let the agency know we're doing it, but we don't have to get permission to do it. we've been given that permission from the awarding agency. And then some other things on here, such as administrative changes or early termination. So we're going to go through when are prior approvals required for some of these different award actions. So as I mentioned, if the investigator is changing the project scope or objectives, and that flows down to our subawardees as well. If our subawardee is changing their scope or objectives, we're going to have to get that approval from the funding agency. Again, changing key personnel, I already mentioned that one. And a lot of times our federal award notices will actually list out the key personnel. Some do, some don't. Again, some it might just be by reference. The third bullet point here was a change in uniform guidance. It used to say the absence for more than 3 months or 25% reduction in time by the project director or principal investigator. They changed that language from absence to disengagement, because your investigator could still be here, right? Could still be on campus, but could be consumed, let's say, with a family matter. And so they're having to disengage from their project. If that happens, then we are obligated then to let the sponsoring agency know about that. Okay. And then the reference here is for you for making budget and program revisions when is prior approval required. That's a 200.308. Okay. Okay. Inclusions of costs that require prior approval. Imagine that they require prior approval. So that could be maybe a subaward. You know, typically we'll get prior approval because we included the subaward in the proposal, and then it was a condition of the award. However, there are times at the award stage or even post-award where an investigator wants to add a new subawardee. In that case, we have to go back and get prior approval. Or it could be that they want to change the subawardee institution. So let's say that our investigator is working with Dr. Smith, and Dr. Smith is at University of Toledo. And so we have a subaward with University of Toledo. Now all of a sudden Dr. Smith has quit University of Toledo and is working for Stanford. Do we have to get prior approval from the agency to terminate the first subaward with Toledo and then issue a subaward to Stanford? And again, it depends. With National Science Foundation, absolutely. With National Institutes of Health, they basically say, well, if it's still with, you know, the investigator Smith, then you don't have to have our authorization. And that was one of those live and learn, because I actually asked the question of a grants management person who chastised me and said, it was already approved in the budget, and if you knew what our prior approvals were, you wouldn't be asking me this question. So it's definitely something to look into, you know, before you go asking the question, do we have those approvals or not? Moving funds out of participant support almost always requires sponsor approval. I already mentioned subawarding. And then if we have changes in our approved cost share matching, you know, if we can't meet those cost share obligations, we would have to go back to the sponsor to see if they would approve lower cost sharing. And it may be the case they would, but they may actually also then reduce our award accordingly. But it's something that we have to be in communication. So always good to know which kind of actions always require prior approval, and then which ones we have been given the authority for prior approval, and we'll go through those in just a second. I have a couple little pop-ups here. Uniform guidance goes on to say no other prior approval requirements may be imposed on us, okay? And that the agency is supposed to respond to our request in writing, in email, right now, 30 days from the date of the request. That doesn't always happen. I know folks at other institutions who have let agencies, you know, they've given them, they've basically written them, asked for a request to do something, didn't hear back, asked for a request, didn't hear back. It went well beyond the 30-day window. That university went ahead and made the change, but they followed up in an email saying, we haven't heard back from you. It's outside the 30-day window. We've gone ahead and taken this action. That way they had it in writing with the agency. But know that uniform guidance does say that the agency is supposed to respond to our request within 30 days. Okay, again, prior approval, when is it required? If you're transferring funds among direct cost categories, you may have to have prior approval. It just depends on the program. It also depends upon the amount being transferred. Okay. So typically if the cumulative amounts exceeds or is expected to exceed 10% of the total budget, you need prior approval. And I just threw this up here. We've already talked about the simplified acquisition threshold. Jeff mentioned on his review that you are not going to be asked what that threshold is, because that threshold changes and actually did change over the past couple of years, but you should know, you know, what it is. So there is the definition of what the simplified acquisition threshold is. It's that dollar amount below which a non-federal entity, us, may purchase property using those small purchase methods, procurement methods. If you remember the little bear claw, it's in the bear claw. Okay, so when have we been given the authority from the funding agencies to go ahead and make some of these changes without getting approval? Okay, and what we're talking about here are expanded authorities. In other words, the funding agencies have expanded their authority, their approval authority to us and given us the ability to make those decisions. So in other words, when is prior approval not required? And it really does depend. It depends on the award type. If it's not a research award, then typically we don't have expanded authorities. So I had an investigator in a unit here that does a lot of service agreements want me to come over and do training on expanded authorities. And I was like, I'm happy to do that, but like 99% of your awards, your service awards, they're not research awards. You don't have expanded authorities. Contracts, you don't have expanded authorities. A lot of cooperative agreements, you might not have expanded authorities. So it really depends. Okay, know your award terms and conditions, and then you should be familiar with the Federal Demonstration Partnership and know that they have a prior approval matrix out there on different award actions by agency, by program type. Do you have to have that memorized for the exam? Hell no. Oh my gosh, the person that could memorize that, I can't imagine that much extraneous information in my brain, but just know that it's out there. Okay, so let's talk quickly about expanded authorities. So again, those limited number of actions that normally require agency approval, but the agency has expanded or given us this authority. Okay. A little bit about the history of expanded authorities. Started with the Florida Demonstration Project, also FDP, which then later became the Federal Demonstration Partnership. So it's the federal agencies along with institutions who have come together to streamline information. So they looked at things like no cost extensions and they said, do we really want to burden an agency and an institution with having every time they have a request for a first no cost extension, because it happens a lot, do we want to burden them with having to get permission? And then the answer was no. Again, on these research awards, we don't want to have to burden them, so we're going to expand our authority and allow the institution to make that decision and to just let us know that they're doing it. So we still have the obligation to have the justification and to approve that no cost extension internally and to let the agencies know. It doesn't mean that it just became a free-for-all and it was just a gimme. So that was just one example, and we'll go through some other examples. Oh yeah, this is just the prior approval waive. This is expanded authorities. This is what we're talking about here. Okay, so typical expanded authorities, you all probably are familiar with these already. You should know these for the exam: the 90 days pre-award spending, the one-time 12-month no-cost extension. That doesn't mean we have to take 12 months, but we can. Okay, and then the carry forward of unobligated balances into future funding periods. Okay, do we have carry forward provision or not? Okay, and of course there are always exceptions. So always just double check your award terms and conditions, double check that federal demonstration partnership matrix to see if we have those authorities or not. And this is just an example of what this looks like. The interesting thing is this matrix does not live on the Federal Demonstration Partnership page. It actually lives on NSF's website. So if you just type into your search engine, Prior Approval Matrix, it will pull up this link for you. And then you also have it in your handouts. So, sorry, I'm whipping through these really really quickly, because a lot of this is just best practice. And what you should know is that there are some limited actions that we can take. We refer to these as expanded authorities, and it's basically the information that was back here. Okay. So for the purposes of the exam, that's what you need to know. Putting this into practice, I think, is a lot more difficult than just taking an exam, because always when the questions come up, do we have the authority to do this? It seems like it takes a lot of digging to be able to answer that question. So again, one thing on the exam, it seems really easy. You go to put it in practice and it's not always as clear-cut as we think it might be. So any questions on expanded authorities or any comments, anything anybody wants to add? Okay, we'll move on then. Subrecipient and subrecipient monitoring and reporting. Again, a lot more came out in uniform guidance than what used to be in the former circulars and has it all in one place. We already talked about the need for federal agencies to ensure that we can properly manage federal funds, and then they have passed that kind of burden on to us. So if we're passing some of the federal funds on to another entity, a subrecipient entity, we need to do our due diligence to make sure that subrecipient entity can also manage those federal funds. So there's quite a bit in uniform guidance about subrecipients and subrecipient monitoring. So under the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act of 2010, so FFADA, you should be familiar with the acronym FFADA, okay? We, as an awardee, a recipient of federal funds, are accountable for reporting how federal dollars are spent, right? It's that transparency is, where did your tax dollars go? What kind of things were they spent on, okay? We also then have to report on subaward dollars over 25K that go to our subrecipients. So we need to gather information from our subrecipients. Not only do we need to make sure that they can manage funds and that they have the systems in place and that they're getting audited just like we are, but we also have to be able to collect data from them on how they expended their funds. So all of the information that you see on this slide, we actually had to report this when we do our FFADA reporting. So at CSU, Chris Miller does this reporting and in usspending.gov, so that way, again, it's all transparent. So she has to gather all of this information. So that's why we are collecting this information from our subrecipients, not just because we're information happy and like to collect information, but because we have to take this information and then report it in usspending.gov as part of our FFADA reporting. Okay. So the FFADA reporting system, FSRS. Okay. So our requirements for a pass-through entity, that's us, when we take federal funds and pass it along to a subrecipient, is that we ensure the subaward is clearly identified to the subrecipient. It has all of the data elements in it that the federal awarding agency gave to us. Okay. We also have to do our due diligence to make sure that they, again, they can manage federal funds. So evaluate the subrecipient's risk of noncompliance. And then have internal controls in place, right? Have steps in place to try to mitigate that risk if we're going to go ahead and sub a portion of the funds to them. Some institutions are going to be more risk averse than others. So some might say, we're not going to do work with that entity. They're too risky. Others might say, yeah, we're going to, but we're going to put these different milestones in place. So and again, that's an internal control. So at CSU, if we have determined that an entity, a sub-entity, is risky, we might issue a fixed price agreement with them. So they have to meet certain milestones before we will release funds to them. So again, how this is done, how the subrecipient monitoring is done, what level of risk the institution will take on, what type of internal controls we put in place is not prescribed in uniform guidance. It just says we have to do it. Okay. We're supposed to be monitoring our subs activities to make sure that they're spending, accordingly. Also verify that every subrecipient is audited, and we're supposed to actually go and look online to see if that subrecipient has been audited or not. A lot of times, we just ask, oh, share with us your most current audit report. We're not really supposed to be doing that. We're supposed to actually be going and looking it up to see if they are being audited or not. And there's going to be some change in language on uniform guidance as far as some of the audit requirements, because they're going to change it. So basically, we as the pass-through entity only have to address any audit issues of our subs that impact our work or our award with them. Okay, so they might have audit findings that are completely outside of work that we're doing with them. We no longer will have to address those. So stay tuned for that change. I don't know that it's come yet. That might be one of the November changes that's coming up. And more subrecipient requirements. So this is just information, again, that we have to get from our subrecipients. So there's a lot of information there in uniform guidance. If you go through and look at some of these references I provided, starting, actually I think it starts at 330 and goes through 332. There's quite a bit there on subrecipient monitoring and what's required of us as a pass-through entity and what's required of our subrecipients. So that's really all we have. I'm not sure why there's that gap there, but oh, that's why there's a gap. It's too big to write. So at the whole end of this, I'll send you all of the acronyms. So you don't have to worry about sitting here trying to fill these out right now. I always think that that's a good way to kind of study, is to, do I know what the acronym is, and do I know what the purpose of this is? Okay, and what do I need to know around it? Okay, so another week with no homework. I know we blew through a lot because in this case, there isn't a lot that's prescribed to us or a lot that you have to memorize for uniform guidance. Instead, you should know about expanded authorities. You should know what areas that we typically have them in. You should know that they're for research awards. And you should know that we have to do our due diligence with subrecipient monitoring and with FAFADA. And other than that, in award management, not that there's not going to be a lot of other stuff on the slides, or sorry, on the exam, but that's really the bulk of it. So any questions before we go through the multiple choice? Are you still out there, people? I'm trying to get a better shot here of more faces. I can only see a couple of faces. Okay, well, let's go ahead. Thank you for saying you're still there. Thanks, Jessica, for popping on. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just talking to myself. Blah, 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 blah. I do this like with my mom. Her phone disconnects a lot, and I'll be like, blah, 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 blah. And that, I don't know how long I blah, blah, blah before I realized she's not there. Funny thing was, yesterday I was talking with her, and I was talking, and I realized we were disconnected. I called her back, and she was still talking as if we had never been disconnected. So she was doing the blah, blah, blah instead of me that time. Okay, so let's get through these, and you can just chime in the chat, please. A notice of award should contain which of these? The recipient's name, name of all project personnel, a link to the original program guidelines, all terms and conditions written out. Which one? And I did try to go through and make sure I didn't do all of the above. I had a lot of all the above questions here I had to rewrite. And it's A, right? The recipient's name. Who is this award being made to? Okay, they do not have to, the federal awarding agency does not have to include all project personnel, but they should include the key or senior personnel. They do not have to include a link to the original program guidelines. Hopefully that's something we have on record. And then they can actually reference terms and conditions. Typically it's referenced by link to something on their website. They don't have to write them out. So it's really nice when they do. So A is the answer here. Oops. Okay. According to uniform guidance, which of the following is true regarding financial management systems? A, they should account for investigator time split between sponsored and non-sponsored work. B, they should be able to compare expenditures with budget. C, they should provide for upload of all receipts. Or D, they should provide for monitoring of subrecipient receipts. B, right? They should be able to compare expenditures with budget. Okay. On A, our system should be able to discreetly identify financial funds versus non-financial type, not financial, wow. Federal funds versus non-federal funds, okay, but not how the investigator is splitting their work. Yeah, we have to report back and do effort reporting, but our financial systems don't have to do that, but financial systems do have to be able to discriminate between federal and non-federal funds. So A was there to kind of throw you off a little bit, but you all weren't thrown off, of course. Okay. Upon award receipt, non-federal entities must establish notebooks for record keeping, a master account per investigator, individual accounts in an approved accounting system, or PayPal accounts for each federal award. Okay, so the answer here is C, individual accounts. So we should be able, again, to discreetly manage every federal project and the funds for every federal project discreetly, not just dump them into one PI account. Can you imagine if we dumped all, PIs would love that, wouldn't they? Dump all of their money into one account and let them just spend. No, we have to discreetly set up accounts for each project type. So, and can you imagine on the last slide, keeping receipts for everything from our subs and us and having to upload scans of receipts to our site? Jessica's like, no. I think about my receipts wadded up like in my wallet. I would be coming to the sponsor programs office, you know, getting my receipts out. Okay, so C. The PIs would oh yeah. So actually I had a PI, the reason why D's on here, we had a PI who was setting up his own PayPal accounts and receiving money from, he had money from NSF to run this program globally, and he was charging people to be part of the program and putting that money into his own PayPal account. That was an audit nightmare, yeah. So my former university said no PayPal accounts for any of our investigators. Okay, what does uniform guidance say about internal controls? Non-federal entities, us, must establish and maintain internal controls. Audit findings should be addressed at least annually. Non-federal entities should use third-party software systems for budgeting, or internal controls are not addressed in uniform guidance. Okay, A, right, it's A. Okay, when is prior approval required? A, when there's a change in project scope due to a change in budget. B, when there's a change in project scope. C, when the PI is out of the country for 3 months. Or D, when the PI gets started 1 month after the project start date. Okay, so everybody's saying B. So it's not A because there might not be an associated change in budget, right? They can change scope without changing the budget. Oftentimes a significant change in budget clues us in to ask the question, is there a change in scope? But not necessarily a change in budget. This one is, I think, could be tricky, and I could see a question like that on the exam when the project director is out of the country. The project director could be out of the country and still 100% engaged on their project, right? Particularly now with all of the ways we have to stay engaged. So that is why C is not a correct answer. And then our PIs always get started late, right? Because we get late notices from our we get late notices of awards and get started late all the time. But if starting late then impacts, somehow makes a significant impact to the budget or scope of work, we may then have to let the agency know. But so the answer here is B, which is an example of a typical expanded authority. 90 days pre-award spending, a one-time 24-month no-cost extension, carry forward of obligated balances, or proposal preparation cost. Careful of the wording on C. Okay, so the answer is A. B, it's not B because it should be a 12-month. It's not C because it should be of unobligated balances, right? And then proposal preparation costs are almost always never allowable costs on an award. There are, of course, times when they are, but it's very rare that proposal preparation costs are allowed. So the answer here is A. FFADA stands for which of these? C. And again, we've been told there aren't going to be dates on the exam, but it's the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act. Okay, and then that was it. So I told y'all it'd be quick today just because there's not as much kind of memorization with this stuff, even though this is like some of the hardest work I think that we do as institutions. So it's just, there's nothing really that's all that prescribed to us. Just you have an obligation to do it and figure out how to do it and stick to how you're doing it. So any questions? Any questions? Are we all good? Yep, you're welcome.
Tricia.
You're welcome. So I know it was a blow through, but there just wasn't much to memorize. I think we just have, what, 2 more sessions? Does that sound right?
Mm-hmm.
A couple more sessions and you're done and like you're ready to take the exam, right? Cool.
Thank you, Trish.
Okay. Yep.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.